So yeah, this is my talk, the Immersive Web in 2019. And there's a lot to define here, and also 2019 just started, so it's going to be a weird talk. So the meat of this talk is actually going to be pre-2019 and how we got here. And I want to talk a little bit about, so before I talk about the Immersive Web, I want to talk about just the web in general. So if we go very far back, the web sort of started, everything I'm going to talk about today is going to involve the 3D web and the immersive web. But if we think about the web as it started, it was basically just built for text documents. And then we got CSS level 1, and all of a sudden we could do fancy things like style our buttons and make navigation bars, and that was fun. And as things have gotten progressively more advanced with higher fidelity, we've started to do really, let's say, questionable things like adding parallax to every single page, and creating, hiring an animator to create a flash intro for your page, right? The web has been progressively sort of adding more and more visual fidelity as the years have worn on. And if you've ever wanted to sort of completely break out of the 3D context, you would need to go through WebGL. And if you're not familiar with WebGL, it's basically an API that operates through the Canvas API, and it sort of gives you a graphics context. It's a little square or a rectangle or whatever shape you want it to be. And it says, okay, you control all the pixels here. And most people don't program in WebGL directly. They use a helper library. So this is a GIF of a few examples from 3JS, which I'll be talking a little bit more about for the rest of this talk. But yeah, so if you've ever wanted to sort of get into 3D on the web, it's always been very manual. And even with these helper libraries, it sort of feels like you're playing in a different environment. It doesn't feel sort of native to the web. And that all started to change, I would say, when Google Cardboard was first announced back in 2014. So this is the first time that WebGL had been hooked up to sort of a device. So if you've never experienced, to a device that had a gyroscope. So if you've never experienced Google Cardboard, you'd put your smartphone into landscape mode, and it would sort of display one screen to your left eye and another screen to your right eye, and you would put it inside this little like $8 cardboard box with two special lenses inside, which are really just like shiny pieces of convex glass, or concave glass, and you would all of a sudden move your head and be able to see into whatever the sort of the WebGL display was showing you. And this is really cool because even though it wasn't sort of like quote unquote true VR, you were able to take a web page, or you were also able to do this through apps, but a lot of web pages were designed for this because it was a really novel use of the gyroscope API, which up to this point hadn't really been used in web pages. And it was sort of the beginning where people were talking about, oh, okay, actually now like mobile devices or computer desktops can actually be used for VR specifically. And VR is this idea where you do basically this, right? It's like putting on a blindfold. And as we're going to see, VR is not the only sort of like way to like change your reality. But if so back in 2014 is sort of when things were like, starting to heat up for the second time for VR. So if you wanted to, the Google Cardboard experience was really nice, but all you could do was 3 degrees of freedom, rotational tracking. And what that means basically is all you could do is look left, up, and turn your head around this way. So if you moved your head in at all, the camera, the view that you were seeing wouldn't move with you. You would need a rig like this with an HTC Vive or an Oculus Rift tied to like a very, like $3,000 computer with a very special graphics card in order to interpret, all the positional movements, all the hand movements, and in order to sort of keep up to date the graphics drivers that this sort of like really intensive VR system was running. And so this is still really nascent days for WebVR. But this was basically the impetus for it. It was that, okay, cool, the web can do, sort of like toy stuff with moving a gyroscope using your smartphone, but we want the web to sort of, as a platform, be able to handle sort of full-scale true VR and be able to expand even beyond that. So there are a bunch of ways to sort of get started with the WebVR API. You can go through it directly. You can use Three.js, or you can use just raw WebGL if you would like. But I've personally always used this library called A-Frame. And so this isn't going to be, this talk isn't about A-Frame, but this is just a quick little demo that sort of lets you see how accessible WebVR has gotten over the past few years. So I don't know if you can read this super well, but this little tag here says a-sphere, and it's basically a custom web component that the A-Frame library defines. And so you can do stuff like a-sphere, and you give it an attribute called a position, and it moves it in x, y, z coordinate space. And you can even assign it a color, which changes its sort of 3D property, 3D material property. And you can do this for a bunch of different assets, and you can, as long as you put them all in between these tags, a-scene, you get something that looks like this. So that markup, seven or eight lines on the previous slide turned into this, and it's fully interactive. So this is an example of what it looks like on a desktop. You can sort of drag around and move using your arrow keys. But if you had a computer that was hooked up to a VR headset, you'd be able to press a button and it would automatically jump into the context. If you were using a VR browser, a VR compatible browser like experimental builds of Chrome or Firefox, you'd be able to press a button and it would sort of all of a sudden be able to interpret your controller movements and your head movements and sort of do true VR. And on top of this, you can also see from here, it like degrades really gracefully to the desktop. If you were on a phone and you had a Google Cardboard with you, you could do Google Cardboard mode. But even if you don't have the cardboard with you, you could also just use your normal gyroscope and sort of wave your phone around. And it's like a really weird experience for sure. Like I'm not going to say that it's like the most optimal thing, but it's really cool that sort of you have a way to reach everyone, even if they don't have access to a very expensive, very niche piece of VR equipment. So yeah, so that sort of, that work with WebVR has been progressing for the last few years. But people were sort of hesitant, browser implementers were sort of hesitant to implement the WebVR spec as it was defined, because people had been focusing on VR specifically, and everything was sort of tied to that use case. It assumed that there was no camera input. It assumed that it assumed a bunch of different things about position, and so there's a few problems with this. One is that sort of mobile AR is now a thing that people know about, and I'm basically going to give all the credit for this to Pokemon Go, because even though this wasn't the highest fidelity AR. People still sort of got a taste of what it meant to go outside of, in your living room is one Pokemon, on the beach is a different Pokemon, and sort of there's that macro level location-based changing, but also you could see the camera input over the game input. And that was so even though there was nothing, it wasn't really used to great effect, it sort of gave people an idea that games could be played spatially and immersively. Using just devices that they already have, which is their smartphones. And then on top of this, using devices that not everyone has, the HoloLens was officially released for its first dev kit in March 2016, and the Magic Leap was officially released just August of last year for its first dev kit as well. And both of these are really important because they're AR headsets. So in the same way that the true VR headsets were sort of the test of whether or not we could do sort of the immersive web for VR, these AR headsets now give us a chance to see things like A-Frame or Three.js or just raw WebGL running in a completely transparent way over the real world. So things are just overlaid and you can sort of see, it's not like putting on the Google Cardboard blinders. You can actually stay in the context of your living room, or go out into the real world and sort of interact with it naturally. So that's cool. Like, it's cool that sort of we have progressed beyond VR, and that this is sort of becoming feasible. But as this post called Progressive WebXR, which is on the Mozilla VR blog, points out, this is a lot of things. There's a lot of new considerations here. So the post is called Progressive WebXR, which is sort of sort of leading on in the tradition of progressive enhancement. So whereas progressive enhancement, upgrades a web page's capabilities depending on what device you're on, this sort of changes the way that the web page is displayed based on what sort of immersive XR capability you can have. So XR is basically just like a meta acronym for AR and VR together, and it's WebXR because this is all, we're focused just on websites, but instead of just having a desktop or just having a mobile version, now you can have a mobile AR version, or you can have a mobile VR version, or a true VR version, or eventually, right, like an AR headset version. And so there's a lot to keep straight here, and I think it's good that we're beginning to develop methodologies around how to sort of how to work around all of these sort of constraints. And out of this, the WebVR API itself has been renamed to the WebXR device API, and the working group that is working on it in the W3C is now the Immersive Web working group, and they're actually they used to be the Immersive Web interest group, and the difference between an interest and a working group is that now their actual charge is to publish a spec, so that's really exciting. And yeah, so that's sort of basically how we got to where we are now, right? Like we have, and that's kind of unsatisfying, right? It's basically, I've said, like, there's a bunch of problems and we're trying to solve them. But I think there's still some good solutions that we've come up with. So A-Frame is still really viable. Google has used it. Google and Mozilla both have used it for a bunch of different sort of production projects. You can do fancy stuff like network it. You can recreate drawing applications. It's really useful and really easy, and it's designed for web designers and people who sort of only know 2D JavaScript to sort of get their feet wet with VR and with WebGL. So it's still a really accessible way, and it's good to see that there's so much support around a VR, a sort of immersive web library like this. Facebook has also gotten into the game. It used to be called React VR, but now it's just React 360, and it's basically just it's basically an API that allows React to sort of handle and gracefully display 3D and 360 video and photos. So it's cool to see that people are sort of building around this technology. And finally, I think one of the things that's most personally exciting to me is that there's this company called Eighth Wall that actually just launched their first thing for the Spider-Man release last year. Their whole thing is web AR marketing. Well, ideally more applications than marketing, but marketing is a pretty obvious one right now. But yeah, so this is there's no AR kit or AR core here. There's no sort of on-device API being used. This is completely running in Safari in the browser, in a normal standard browser. So it's just really cool to see that companies at the end of 2018 and sort of going into 2019 are actually beginning to invest in VR and AR professionally. And then there is also some exciting stuff sort of happening already in 2019 around the immersive web. So the very first thing is that just 2 days ago, on February 5th, on Tuesday, the first public working draft of the WebXR spec was published. And so what this means is that basically now we're on a track to actually publishing an actual WebXR spec, which means it'll go to the Safari that you know and love, and Firefox and Chrome and every other browser, and Samsung browsers and Opera, et cetera, et cetera. right? Whatever browser decides to implement it, they can implement it knowing that the API won't all of a sudden change in 3 months, and then they'll have to scrap a bunch of their engineering work. So it's really exciting to see the API sort of reach maturity. And along with this, this also means that like experimental implementations that have been built around the draft version of the WebEx Our API will hopefully get better. So there are a couple projects. One is from Google. Well, they're under 2 names, but they're basically the same thing, which is fusing the Safari or the Chrome browser on Android and iOS devices, respectively, to a Three.js session. And so this really gives you really accurate AR capabilities with just a smartphone or just an iPad, as you can see in the GIF here. And those cubes are actually rendered just using regular WebGL. So basically, as long as you use this custom browser, you're able to sort of prototype with what the WebEx Our API could look like. And Mozilla has a similar effort. They actually published an iOS app that makes this process super easy. So you can just make a normal web page, and as long as you visit it in this special little iOS app or custom compile an Android app, you can sort of use regular WebGL or Three.js and sort of begin to play around with really experimental, really sort of spatial computing concepts. And then, yeah, so that's basically all that I have for the Immersive Web itself. And I'm really excited for sort of to have seen this like years-long progression into 2018 and 2019. But yeah, so one last thing is that I've actually just sort of started a consulting business, and I don't actually want to have clients. And so basically, I'm putting this slide here not for asking for work. Basically, if you're interested in the Immersive Web, if you want to learn more, if you want to talk to me, this is a good way to do it. And I have a bunch of free time now. So yeah, if you can either reach me here or at these other various places on the internet. Yeah, thank you.